Welcome to our series of colloquiums on unpacking poverty and its impacts on student success. We're doing this because many of our nation's schools face the challenges of poverty, but they vary from where that school is and the types of challenges it faces. 15% of school districts and 30% or more of school-age children, for example, live in poverty, but 21% of all school-age children live in one of these districts. Throughout the last decade, the number and percent of public school students who live in poverty or near poverty has increased. Since the year 2000, some of these increases have been dramatic. The numbers of distressed neighborhoods climbed by nearly 3/4 since 2000. Poverty has become more clustered and concentrated in distressed and high-poverty neighborhoods. This causes a double burden. And suburbs, especially in the South, have begun to experience some of the steepest increases in concentrated poverty. So more of our students in the past decade lived in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, and more of our school districts were beginning to experience the challenges of educating students in concentrated poverty. We're going to see a series of maps now to show the spread and concentration of students living in poverty and the challenges school districts face. This first map looks at the percent of school-age children who live in poverty by school district. This tells us in that school district which percent of the children live in poverty. Not all of these students may go to the school district, but it gives us a good sense of the magnitude and intensity of poverty that are faced by the children who live in that school district. Another way to look at this is to use free and reduced price school lunch data at the district level and say of the students that go to the district, which percent of students are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. As we can see in both of these maps and graphs, the level of poverty that our school districts deal with varies considerably, from having over 40% of their students in the district living in poverty and more than 75% of their students getting free and reduced price lunch, to other communities where it's less than 1/4 of students are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, and only a very small percent of students are living in areas are living in poverty. This tells us that each school's experience with poverty really varies based on where it is, that there isn't some sort of uniform experience with poverty across all schools. And it can go from quite extreme to almost non-present. So why do we need to unpack poverty? What do we mean by unpacking poverty? Well, it's our postulate that the current debate around poverty in schools is often non-productive, that it's really driven by the two ends of the debate, which leads to sort of a static and frozen debate that doesn't go anywhere. That either there's the view that poverty is so intense in some schools that until we do something to change poverty, to have sort of social improvement, even social revolution almost, we really can't expect our schools to do much more than they're doing now. To the other end of it saying that we just can't even really consider poverty in schools, that we just got to focus on having good teachers, good leaders, good curriculums, and when we do that, that will take care of poverty, and poverty won't really be a big driver of student success. We argue the evidence shows a much more complex and challenging answer to that question that doesn't give itself to simple one way or the other answers. But one way to break that logjam, we believe, is to unpack poverty to better understand its components. Because not only does the level of poverty vary by place, but the type of poverty students live in and its impacts, we will show in this series, vary by place. And it's only by unpacking poverty and understanding how its different elements vary by place and intensity that we can really begin to see how we can find solutions. And in some ways makes this seem more solvable than when we look at it all together, because many of those components, as we will see, have a better set of solutions than this overall sense of what we need to do to solve poverty. So our goal is that having unpacked poverty, we can organize schools and community family supports to lessen and mitigate its impact. How are we going to do this? Well, what we're going to try to do in this series is break poverty down into its constituent elements. How is life different for poor and non-poor students? We're going to examine the educational impacts of different elements of poverty. We're going to determine how these elements and impacts vary by place and from school to school. And to do that, we're going to try to really understand the upper bound intensities in the most impacted schools. For example, we're about to hear a series on our first set our first colloquium on food insecurity. In the most impacted school, what is the highest percent of students that are food insecure? Is this 10%? Is this 20%? Is this 50%? Are there schools where 75% of students are food insecure? And then on a more sense of that's the upper bound, what is the range? What is the range we might find for what percent of students in different schools at different levels of poverty or different locales with the same levels of poverty might face? And then our goal is to identify solutions that exist and need to be scaled, or to identify this is an area where new solutions need to be developed because we don't really have a good solution, and how this might vary by type and level and place and intensity. Over the next 2 years, we're going to be holding a series of these colloquiums, both live and in person in Baltimore, and open and widespread on the web. We will examine each component, its scale, its location, its magnitude, its educational impacts, and what is known about effective solutions. And you'll be able to find these colloquiums on the web at the Everyone Graduates Center's website, and we'll also be building related information around that, including interviews with key people in the field, links to the relevant and key articles or the relevant and key advocacy work going on in this area, and also links and where we can short synopsises of what you can do in your school or in your district to tackle these components of poverty. Throughout this series, we've sort of broken poverty down into 8 broad components, which you can see in the screen in front of you. This is a working list. It will evolve over time as we dig deeper into this. But this gives you a sense of what we say unpacking poverty and its components. These are some of the components we're talking about that we'll be looking at in this series. Just want to give you one example to give you a flavor of this before we launch into our first colloquium. It involves eyesight and eyeglasses. So it's common practice for districts to pay for vision screening in kindergarten, first grade, often second grade. And typically what will happen in many high poverty areas is that parents will get a notice in kindergarten, your student needs eyeglasses, your child needs eyeglasses. We'll get a notice again in first grade, your child needs eyeglasses. We'll get a notice again in second grade, your child needs eyeglasses. When at that point the cost of those 3 vision screenings are more than if simply eyeglasses had been provided to the student back in kindergarten directly, and not just sort of notice sent off and saying, you try to figure out a way to get your child glasses, which obviously parents want to do and are very invested in, but is often, when living in poverty, is not so easy and simple as to easily go to your corner mall and pick up your kid's eyeglasses. So that's an example of an issue that has real impact, that is its scale and magnitude is not often well appreciated. How many kids are we talking about and what locales? And for which actually some straightforward answers exist, that if we get those answers to the right kids at the right place, we can actually help more kids see, help more kids read, and actually do it cheaper and more effectively than what we're currently doing. So with that, we ask you to join us in our endeavor, and welcome to our series on unpacking poverty.